Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest is Randy Baier. Today we'll be discussing the latest books that Rip Rap has received, including those on the economics of growth and prosperity, the ethics of bioethics, the presidential politics, and the medicalization of society. Welcome to Rip Rap, Randy.
Great to be here again, Jim. Thank you.
At first glance, maybe some of these books may not seem to be relevant. They're good scholarly studies, but this first one, Good Capitalism, Bad Capitalism, and Economics of Growth and Prosperity, really is pretty interesting because we're supposedly living in a growth, economy. We've got the highest Dow Jones average ever, 14,000.
Keeps going up, doesn't it?
But
Whatever
there's
that means.
prices that we're paying for that, and so this is one of the forms talked about in this book is entrepreneurial capitalism and how that's supposed to lead to growth and prosperity. So it really is, and the author is from the University of California, Berkeley, has a Nobel laureate in economics. But I think that there's some issues that this book touches on, which is there's also what they talk about bad capital when it's not working so well. And one of them is that if you don't have the resource to do it, then it's not going to work for you. If you are, where you have the advantage of being a huge corporation with lots of resources, it may work, although General Motors and Dodge and other corporations find out that's not even enough.
I just read an article in the Wall Street Journal about the disappointment with call centers in India. The model, of course, was based on, it's not just call centers, it's any kind of economic impulse to use expertise in India to supplement your work, your output here. So the prices are getting higher. This is the problem. You're in this global economy, and lo and behold, call centers are only 25% of what you have to pay here. Well, that's not true anymore because a very sophisticated workforce is graduating in India on a regular basis. They are completely fluent in world languages, especially English, obviously, and these are very talented and hireable people, and they're going from India to England, to Australia, to the United States for work. And if they want to stay there, they're demanding higher pay there. So the pay is actually coming much closer to 75–80% of what it would cost locally. So some companies are actually coming back to open up support centers here.
That's one of the things that's fascinating is the flow through. In other words, so they sent, they've outsourced, important tasks like customer service and product service to countries like India. Then you develop a middle class who then buys cars, and now we're at a point when the oil is becoming scarce, and they're talking about India and China being the next major markets for selling cars.
Yes.
And so now we're competing with the very people that we outsource to.
Right.
And that happens in some very real ways. I mean,
Yeah.
and then the people who are earning a lot more money in India than many other people are now creating markets that then creating even more of a disparity between the very well off and those who are not so well off in India. Well, the disadvantages of capitalism is also pointed out in this other book that we have by Charles Correllis, The Persistence of Poverty, why the economics of the well-off can't help the poor. Because one of the big arguments in favor of capitalism, well, everyone's going to benefit, and what this book says, no, it hasn't. And during the past 4 decades when we were supposedly hitting our big economic capitalistic stride, the distance has just gotten bigger between rich and poor. Nobody exactly knows why there hasn't been an improvement despite the fact that society's made massive efforts to have that happen. And now we're backpedaling as fast as we can go from programs like unemployment insurance, welfare benefits, and programs like that. It just isn't working.
Yeah. The thing I liked about this book was that he takes some trouble, some pain to actually define poverty from various aspects, from the fact that it's obviously relative depending on where in the world you live. It's also dependent on access to income and access to the things one needs to live. So he talks about how say in the Pacific based on certain local definitions, even though from the point of view of the Western world, the industrialized world, people would be considered very poor, but yet to themselves they're not poor. There's no local definition of poverty. Poverty would be you would really have to be strung out in a particular way with no resources whatsoever. But so that was, I think that's related to the thrust you were taking, is he's saying that we've lost contact with, in a sense, the way we define poverty. And you have to start from there in order to understand how you can actually address it.
I think the other thing is, and he touches on that, is the underlying factors to thrive in a capitalistic society have very solid and important reasons why you would thrive. In other words, you have to have a certain advantage, you have to have a certain amount of education, you have to have a certain amount of access to power, you have to have certain access to the dynamics that will take you into powers of power, whether it's corporate or education or nonprofit organizations. It doesn't just happen.
Yes.
And those who are not able to get the education, who don't have the access, start cycling. That's what we've seen in the past 4 decades. And then on top of that, those who are privileged, and some people are enormously privileged, and they have these huge amounts of wealth, personal wealth, give some back, but not enough to make a difference. And
yes,
so
to change
now
things in
that
some way.
also increases the dynamics, that, you know, greed becomes greed becomes greed kind of thing.
Yeah.
So what you're having is, what's fascinating in the long-term setting is that people are becoming poorer in a sense, because they're becoming ever more distance away from the advantages of being in power.
Right.
And, so
And
now
can't get even to a base level of resources that
Right.
they need in order to make some kind of personal progress.
And then part of the capitalistic system has also been, and we're facing huge crises now that are implicit. We have a lot of unfunded entitlements, whether it's Social Security or Medicare, that were set up by the privileged, but have not been fully funded, because if you were to fund them, it would cost more money, you know, with decreased resources, and people complain about high taxes.
Right.
And so that then creates a whole nother dynamic. But the thing's starting to cycle on itself, and that's what's really troubling. And at the very least, you know, the very least, there is this awareness that it's not going away. Everybody said, well, it'll go away. We just got to have the system work. Well, it isn't. And so I think it's a great book, because it's touching on that and trying to get a handle on why isn't it.
So, you know, I wonder how a book like this could actually have public effect, actually help change something.
Well, I think that's one of the valuable advantages or strengths of scholarly literature, if you're at least raising the question, and nobody else is raising it.
That's true.
That's a very courageous.
You have to at least ask the question.
Right.
That's very true.
And also, this is built on solid research. So, I mean, it isn't like it's a vacuous or baseless kind of concern.
Right.
It's something that he's brought all this together and say, hey, you know, over here, we still have this going on. It's like some of my students have gone to the Bahamas or Jamaica, and there's 2 cities. There's 2 places. There's the tourist side, and then there's where everyone else lives.
Absolutely.
It's abject poverty.
Right.
You know?
Absolutely.
So on the tourist side, it's glitzy. It's wonderful.
Jamaica's especially well known for that.
Yeah. And, you know, everything's just right up to snuff, and you have the 4-star hotels, and then just around the block, you've got people living in just
where the workers are living.
And so the workers come from their abject poverty to, you know, help fluff pillows and change.
It's very
sheets
true
for
in
the
Indonesia too. It's very
it's
similar.
really troubling. Well,
Well, speaking of public policy, what's next?
well, this is actually quite interesting. I thought is about presidential politics, because who's going to lead the change? We say that our political leaders will do that. The realities of our economic, I'd say, disaster or crises that we're facing are such that there's very little room for a presidential, for president to really change much. There's, they say, well, you can use the bully pulpit
right,
of the president's presidency, but nobody's really wanting to face the issues. And as soon as they did, their whole ratings the polls plummet, because no one wants to hear the bad truth. So anyway, this was a book on the big vote in terms of gender, consumer culture, and the politics of exclusion in 1890s to 1920 by Liette Gidlow,
to bring in anybody who's been excluded. Right.
Yeah.
As we tried, I mean, the nation tried in the 2000 election and the 2004.
Were an important part
were a
of
major
that.
part of that.
Yeah.
Yes. Right.
But And what she says is that this is leading up to the modern culture of consumption. But what happened in 1929? The big bust.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been listening to NPR and other media, and everyone's saying, well, okay, so the Dow Jones has hit 14,000. What does that mean? And they said, we haven't had a market correction, which is usually a drop of 10% to 20%. Haven't had that happen for a while. And I was thinking when I was looking at this book, we are really ripe for something. I don't want to say that, but she's an associate professor of history at Wayne State.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought this is kind of interesting, particularly in lieu of the persistence of poverty and this whole thing of leadership, that you get out the vote, you do everything you can, and disasters still happen.
It still happens.
Because it's being driven by other things. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, she talks about the expert citizen. And I think that's quite evocative. That
sounds very Greek, doesn't it? Or
yeah.
Platonic.
These groups were ones, she said they were hardly the first citizens to value education, familiarity with law, languages, and history. And they weren't the first to prize expertise in citizenship. But they did contribute, and they were very aware about the need to get leaders into political office and what to do about that. And then I thought it was also fascinating that to get out the vote included motion pictures and radio. And she says these are the methods of Wrigley and Barnum, the circus people, which I thought was also kind of fascinating. So then there's this whole hoping that you could use infomercials, like she says, Ross Perot did.
Yes, at the time, right.
All you got to do is beat the drum, and away you go. In fact, there's been so many of these infomercials that when we first got the cable television, the satellite television, we were going to get 500 channels, and now what we're getting are half of those or more filled up with infomercials.
That's all it is.
It's not
well,
any
I shouldn't
content
say all,
at all.
But no, it's all advertising. We're paying twice. We were delivered a bill of goods, unfortunately.
Now, this actually has a chain of continuity, or a line of continuity, because we don't normally mention books that are fiction, but this book by Richard North Patterson is The Race, meaning presidential race, and the question is, can an honest man become president? And it's written by, the author is a former trial lawyer who served as the SEC's liaison to the Watergate special prosecutor. And this is kind of wicked fun, because he's supposedly, the main character is Corey Grace, who's a handsome and charismatic Republican senator from Ohio who's plunged into an act of terrorism in a fierce presidential primary battle. And I thought, well, this is just wicked
It's not
fun.
just another Grisham novel?
No.
About
this is not
legal intrigue and...
No, this guy has written some 14 pretty interesting books. But I got that, and I thought, well, this is pretty interesting. And he's a former New York Times best-selling author. So, but there is this question, I don't think you can substitute ethics of the entire population or entire community by having one person elected and having them fix it, because this phenomenon that we've had with polls and all this stuff, if you're saying something that everyone doesn't want to hear, you're going to get voted out or become relatively powerless.
And you have to make so many compromises, it seems, at least that's the truism of big politics, that there's a lot to be said for local action, which comes from grassroots initiatives and people struggling against power to make change happen. It's hard to do it from the top, because by the time, at least in our country, I shouldn't sound so cynical. There are some real, thank God, there are good, active, committed representatives, senators at the top of the power structure in Washington. But it seems that so many compromises have to be made to have good action actually happen. But
one
it's
of
difficult.
the difficulties with democracy on one hand is a wonderful dynamic for for a community to decide how it's going to do things.
Yeah.
The problem is that even that can be distracted and enamored of completely destructive and self-destructive moments. And if it collectively decides it's not going to address something, now you have a real problem.
Yeah.
And that actually leads to the next book about the ethics of bioethics and mapping the moral landscape. It's edited by Lisa Eichenweiler and Felicia Cohn. But there's a huge issue that underneath this sort of bland title about what are we going to do with ethical issues in science, medicine, and public health. There's some really serious underlying issues there about genetic manipulation and designer babies, and what are we going to do with that? And the bioethicists are the people who are supposed to be examining these issues and giving us some guidance. But of course, it's so easy when you're in that position of power to accede to those
Yes, right.
who want to.
And justifying it by saying, you know, principles of biology say this and this. So the ethicists are coming along and saying, well, wait a minute, what's the ethics
When she
behind?
She notes Fox, who says that the cognitive characteristics of American bioethics begin with the capacity to think rationally, logically, and objectively, and that you have rigor, clarity, and consistency. But the problem is that doesn't always happen, you know, and we're having these, and this even goes into publication now, where we've had these issues come out with various journals that found out, whoops, someone's been publishing,
well,
and they had distorted
the case in Korea about the clone case.
Well, we've had a number of complete collapses in the publishing industry of responsible behavior. One of them was the New York Times, who had reported it completely, not completely, but substantially concocted his reports, and he got to have a big name, and then he was drummed out of the court. But not until after the damage was done. We've had 2 or 3 instances of that, include the case with the woman reporter who, you know, found out that she had inside information and didn't reveal that.
Yes, right.
So, and then they've had the New England Journal of Medicine, and they've had other famous international publications where, you know, things just collapsed all the way through. And that's what she talks about in this book, is that an author's activity sits at the center of publication. So all the people who provide the infrastructure, from compositors, sales distribution managers, printing firms, warehouses, financial record keepers, the people who acquire the text, the people who edit it, the reasons why they edit it, how it's peer reviewed, all of those can collapse.
They're
around,
complicit in the
because if all you're trying to do is to get money, you know, and then you're going to go after the big author, the one with the big name, and you're going to ignore something that's a harder truth and you don't think will play out, that all has an impact on what's published. And so as she points out, this becomes more than a little, you know, she talks about the role of editors and peer reviewers, and even who the professors select as, you know, to be mentors to graduate students, because the graduate students are the next generation to be coming in, and if they don't get a mentor, then essentially they're silenced in this process. So I thought this is pretty fascinating stuff. And then she actually has a chapter on the virtue of attacking the bioethicists. In other words, raising issues of where things are not going well. And I thought that was pretty fascinating. Mapping the moral landscape. Actually, that's part of an ongoing topic of discussion right now, because for various reasons our technology and science have evolved to the point where we're able to shape the physical landscape in some pretty profound ways. I've heard that there are now identifying specific genes, you know, for muscular dystrophy or diabetes and all that stuff. Well, what do you do if you have that information?
Well, if you find out that you may be developing Alzheimer's, or you might develop Parkinson's or something of this nature.
Well, the women that now they've identified the gene for breast cancer. So some women are having tests done to see if they have that gene, and then they're having mastectomies. They're cutting off their breasts because they don't even want to risk the cancer. And also, the whole thing is about possibilities. In other words, if you start feeling or you can't have kids, how far do you go toward in doing what you need to do in order to have kids? Do you have in vitro fertilization? Do you go through the whole cycle?
Sure, this is a really big issue because the money
And then
involved.
if you don't, does that reflect on you personally? Have you done everything that you could do to be a mother or a father? It's a really troubling thing, and that gets into this next book about repro genetics, law, policy, and ethical issues, edited by Lori Knowles and Gregory Kabnick. And this touches on that exact problem. Lori Knowles is formerly of the Hastings Center. She's an independent bioethics consultant. There seems to be sort of a theme here. Research associate at the University of Alberta's Health Law Institute. Gregory Kabnick is a associate for philosophical studies at the Hastings Center and editor of the Hastings Center report. But this talks about, there's cloning of Dolly the sheep a decade ago, and now they've got more advances in embryonic stem cell research. It's certainly
right, and cloning very small level of things as
right.
well, not just full animals, so to speak.
But it also gets into this thing about stem cell research. Mm-hmm. This is a huge issue because some people are aware that it could make literally a life and death version for them, issue for them. So then what is the source for that? People who are opposed to it are arguing, well, this involves killing babies or embryos, and they're against that. Other people are saying, well, it's not babies. You can use, umbilical cord, blood, or other, sources of it. But it's just heart-wrenching, and they just had a big discussion in Congress about this. Who's going to govern reprogenic technology? Who's going to say yes or no? And that
especially when the technology gets to be to the point where it's not just specialized within the rarefied world of the medical community, but it's a test that's affordable, a test that can make a difference, and it's more widespread, is what I'm saying. I mean, if you look at the technology of heart bypass operations, they're doing things 15 years ago now that 15 years ago, 20 years ago, were unheard of and not developed. They were not at that point. And so now it's almost, it's an odd thing, but it's almost a routine in a certain sense. I mean, if you go to a cardiac hospital, bypass is a routine operation. I mean, it's not in the world of medicine in general, but I mean that. And so you get to the other point, well, what does that say about lifestyle or about our whole view of health, if we can sort of replace these things? Hip operations is another one. Apparently, hip operations are becoming absolutely routine and very and have a major impact on lifestyle.
Well, and the other thing that's troubling about this,
at least in our in our culture, I mean,
well,
in our
what troubles me about this is that it's technology, so it keeps being upgraded. So that means there's certain obsolescence factors. So you have this big operation, they put in a stent, for example, and then it's not working because as it starts being used on a wide basis, then people become aware, well, it isn't as solid as they thought it would, and now there's this new version.
Right, there has to be, you're part of the testing phase, in other words, right.
But installing the stent is not a easy thing to do. That's a major heart operation, and so these issues, there's those pacemakers that have the ability to do the shock,
Sure. Sure.
Now they're finding out there was problems with that technology.
There have been, yeah.
And so now they got to go and replace
and the other issue is going back to the books we started off with, Capitalism, Good and Bad, and that is the, I guess you'd call it the trickle down, or the extreme have and have not aspect of this. We're at kind of a rarefied level talking about these fine tunings of bioethics and what our technology is giving us. And yet 70% of the world is essentially denied access to any of this. We're not distributing this kind of wealth equally around the globe.
Plus, even in this country,
and within our own,
people are saying, okay, you could have it, but we're not going to pay for it.
Somebody's making a choice.
Yeah,
the operation.
Or someone's saying, well, you're at an age where it's not, we're not going to invest in you since you're 85 years old. We're not going to put $500,000 of technology
That's
in
a core question in any of these books.
They talk about how the U.S. government now has 5 commissions on bioethics. The National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, the President's Commission for the Study of Ethical Problems in Medicine and Biomedical and Behavioral Research, and so on. I mean, this is a heavy-duty issue, and people becoming aware of the really drastic consequences that can come from doing this. I remember that guy who had the first heart transplant. Was it Barney Clark? The guy suffered horribly, and he only lived for like 21 days or something before he died. And he had the first transplant. So there's a real issue here. How are we going to vet this? How are we going to look at these before we actually do them? And it's a very important issue. And then, what kind of policy? And each country has a slightly different take. United Kingdom,
Sure.
and Canada, the United States, about what's the best way to go. At the same time, the overwhelming process or underlying process is the capacity to relieve suffering and distress. So everyone agrees that's what ought to happen, and this is wonderful, but the cost and the consequences of it are something to take a look at.
Yeah, definitely.
Of course, that leads into the next book, The Medicalization of Society.
Can I get a pill?
Yeah, really. Give me a pill. On the Transformation of Human Conditions into Treatable Disorders by Peter Conrad. This is kind
Well,
of...
it's interesting because everything gets a label now. I mean, on the sort of
Well, that's what he's
quotidian
talking
level.
about.
Yeah, that you now, you're somebody would call you high strung in 1950 or 1970, and now you have some 4-letter acronym that
They keep
tells you
revising
what's
that
wrong with you.
compendium of all the
Right.
different illnesses, the physician's desk reference.
That's right.
Peter Conrad is a Harry Copland Professor of Social Sciences at Brandeis University, and he's also co-author of Deviance and Medicalization from Badness to Sickness and co-editor of the Double-Edged Helix. What a title.
Yeah.
But this is the same thing about short stature, social anxiety, andropause, which is male menopause, erectile dysfunction. I mean, how many ads are we seeing on television now for ED?
It's money. It's money.
Adult ADHD, attention deficit, sexual orientation. He's turned, just like you said, they've turned it into everything is becoming its own category. And of course, there are always pills.
There's just every, if you look at the daily dose of radio and television and media, print as well, you'd think that eventually your body will fall apart and you will die. But you think like right now you are nothing but a walking disease and decrepit entity because you're overweight. You can't keep it up. You have no interest in life. You're arguing with everybody around you, and it's all based on this medical. You're just a medical experiment because it has so much to sell you.
Well, we've taken another tour of the books.
Yeah, this is an interesting pick this time.
Well, bioethics to the aroma of God's Spirit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for being on Ripley.
Thanks very much. I hope to do it again.